Hi guys, tonight we're gently stepping into the quiet yet extraordinary life of Mary Shelley, the young woman who would one day give the world a creature born not from hatred, but from imagination, fear, and a strangely tender curiosity. In the next moments, you'll hear how a 19-year-old reshaped literature forever, creating a story that sparked an entire movement. This won't be a tale of horror, but of the soft places where genius and solitude meet. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. And so, let's begin drifting into her world, one slow breath at a time. Mary Shelley was born into a universe of ideas long before she understood the weight of any of them. Arriving on an early August morning in 1797 inside a small London home, filled with books, debates, and the quiet murmur of people who believed the world could be different if only someone dared to imagine it so. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a writer unlike most of her age. Bold, fearless, and openly hopeful about a future where women could think, speak, and live without constraints. Her father, William Godwin, was a philosopher who believed in reason above chaos, always weaving his thoughts into pages that tried to make sense of the human experience. Yet, from the very beginning, Mary's life carried a soft shadow, because her mother passed away only days after her birth, leaving the infant girl surrounded by love but touched by a quiet, lingering absence she would feel her entire life. Growing up, Mary wandered through her father's study like a small ghost, woven into the edges of his thinking, studying the spines of books she could barely lift, listening to discussions she barely understood, but absorbing every tone, every rhythm, every spark of curiosity. Her childhood wasn't loud or crowded. It was a gentle drift between silence and imagination, a slow opening of her inner world. Though her father remarried, the house never quite regained the warmth Mary had lost before she could even name it. Instead, she created a world inside her mind, one that grew wide and deep, filled with landscapes she invented and characters she shaped from quiet observation. As she grew older, she began to write small stories in the corners of her notebooks, soft experiments with thoughts that didn't yet have a destination. Those early writings were not bold declarations or fierce arguments. They were gentle sketches of a young mind trying to understand life, grief, longing, and the strange space between what is real and what is imagined. She would often sit near the window during long, overcast afternoons, watching the sky shift in muted colours, while she wrote lines that drifted like calm waves, letting her thoughts settle into shapes that later would bloom into something much larger. By the time she entered her teenage years, Mary's imagination had become a quiet sanctuary where she stored every whisper of emotion, every dream, and every fear. She didn't know it yet, but all these small inner worlds would one day converge into a story that would echo across centuries, carried by a creature the world would never forget. And as the nights grew longer, and the world outside felt heavier, young Mary learned something she never spoke aloud, that creation is often born from silence, and that the softest beginnings can lead to the loudest legacies. Mary entered her teenage years with a quiet intensity that set her apart from almost everyone around her, moving through each day with the soft determination of someone who felt more at home in thoughts than in conversations, and more at ease with ideas than with the predictable rhythm of daily life. Her father's home was always filled with visitors, writers, thinkers, poets, people who debated passionately over dinner, while Mary listened from the edges, absorbing their words like drifting lanterns lighting small corners of her imagination. She rarely interrupted, never demanded attention, and yet her presence was unmistakably felt by those who noticed how carefully she watched the world. During long afternoons, she would slip away from the noise of conversation and climb toward the quiet corners of the house, sometimes finding refuge in the garden, where the wind moved gently through the leaves as if whispering stories of its own. She would take a notebook, sit near the old stone wall, and write without urgency, letting her thoughts float freely. These entries were not yet the shape of future novels. They were simple reflections, soft questions about life, loss, and the strange stillness that often settled over her heart. Her father, despite his distant nature, encouraged her curiosity. He believed deeply in education, and even though he had little time to guide her directly, he allowed her the freedom to explore his library as though it were a world crafted solely for her. In those shelves she found works of philosophy, early science, travel journals, poetry, and stories of strange wonders that stretched her imagination into new shapes. The boundaries between reality and possibility began to blur in her mind, not through chaos but through gentle curiosity. Mary learned to let her mind wander into spaces most people ignored. She would imagine worlds beneath the surface of ordinary things, a shadow becoming a character, a distant noise becoming a moment of suspense, the flicker of a candle becoming a heartbeat of something unknown. And yet, her life outside these inner worlds remained calm and unremarkable. She helped around the house, read quietly in the evenings, and rarely caused trouble. But inside, a quiet storm of imagination was forming, one that grew stronger with every story she read and every thought she dared to follow to its end. When Mary was 16, her world shifted in a way she never expected. Her father welcomed a new visitor into their home, a young poet named Percy Bysshe Shelley, whose presence felt like a sudden change in the atmosphere. A warm breeze passing through a still room. Percy was vibrant, passionate, unpredictable, and endlessly curious. He believed in ideas the way some people believed in destiny, and he carried an energy that seemed to awaken something dormant in Mary. Their conversation stretched late into the evening, soft and exploratory, weaving through philosophy, dreams, and the quiet mysteries of life. For the first time, Mary felt like someone truly understood the landscape of her inner world. This connection, though gentle, marked the beginning of a journey that would change her life and eventually lead her toward the creation that would define her legacy forever. Mary's connection with Percy Shelley grew in a way that felt both quiet and inevitable, unfolding slowly like a long breath taken after years of holding everything inside. And though she was still so young, she sensed that this meeting would leave an imprint on her life that nothing else quite could. Their conversations drifted through ideas as though they were exploring hidden rooms of the mind together, moving gently from philosophy to dreams, from fears to the small wonders of existence. And Percy listened to her thoughts with a sincerity she had rarely experienced. He encouraged her imagination, not with loud praise, but with thoughtful questions that invited her to wander deeper. Yet life in her father's house became more complicated. Percy was already married, a fact that created a silent tension that hovered at the edge of every interaction. Mary tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the rare sense of being understood, the feeling that someone finally saw the quiet strength she carried behind her calm expression. When they began meeting in the garden, walking along the worn paths as the sky faded into the soft colours of evening, Mary felt the world shift around her. Percy spoke of possibility, of living freely, of daring to follow one's inner truth even when the world offered reasons to remain still. For Mary, whose life had often felt shaped by loss and gentleness, this invitation into something bold felt like a door opening to a future she had never imagined for herself. Eventually, their bond grew strong enough that they made a decision that would change everything. They left together quietly and without her father's blessing. The journey that followed was not marked by dramatic gestures or reckless danger. Instead, it was a slow unfolding of new landscapes, long walks through unfamiliar towns, nights spent talking beneath dim candlelight, and a growing understanding of how deeply their lives had begun to intertwine. Mary kept a journal during these travels, filling its pages with observations of the world around her. Quiet lakes that looked like mirrors, distant mountains softened by mist, small villages where life moved at a pace slower than thought. She wrote about Percy too, though gently, capturing not just his words but the way he spoke them, the way he seemed to carry both hope and turmoil within him. Their travels were not luxurious. Money was scarce, and they often relied on the kindness of strangers or the promise of future earnings. But Mary found something comforting in the simplicity of their days. There was a freedom in having so little, a quiet reassurance in knowing that imagination could fill the spaces left empty by material things. During those months, Mary began to understand the depth of her own inner landscape. The world around her, its beauty, its strangeness, its unpredictability, seemed to echo the shifting contours of her thoughts. Though she didn't yet know it, these early travels were weaving themselves into the foundation of the story she would one day write. A story shaped not by horror, but by questions about life, creation, and the fragile boundaries between the familiar and the unknown. Mary's journey with Percy soon carried them across borders, moving gently from one landscape to another, as though they were drifting through chapters of a story still being written, each place offering a quiet whisper that shaped the rhythm of their days. They travelled through France and into Switzerland, walking along dusty roads where the air felt warm and heavy, then settling into small inns where the nights were calm except for the soft murmur of distant travellers. Money remained sparse, yet Mary found a kind of peace in the simplicity of their life, discovering that when everything unnecessary falls away, the mind has room to grow. She often spent long hours watching the changing scenery from a window, tracing the outlines of hills with her eyes, imagining the stories that might live in the shadows between trees or beneath the surface of a still lake. Percy wrote during these hours, his thoughts scattered across pages like wandering birds searching for a place to land, and Mary admired the way his ideas seemed to flicker with both brilliance and restlessness. Their relationship, though deep and meaningful, was not without its quiet sorrows. Percy's complicated past and uncertain future created moments of tension that rippled gently through their otherwise calm routine, and Mary carried her own unspoken fears, about her father's disappointment, about the fragile path their life was taking, about what it meant to choose something so unconventional. Still, despite the uncertainties, she felt herself growing, not loudly but steadily, like a tree deepening its roots beneath the soil. When they reached Switzerland, the landscape changed dramatically. The mountains rose around them like ancient guardians, their peaks lost in drifting clouds, and the lake stretched wide and silent, reflecting skies so pale they seemed almost dreamlike. There was something healing in that scenery, something that allowed Mary's imagination to expand in new directions. They rented a modest home near Lake Geneva, and for the first time since leaving England, Mary felt settled enough to let her thoughts sink fully into the world around her. Each day brought a slow rhythm. Morning walks along the shoreline, afternoons spent writing or reading, evenings filled with conversations that drifted through philosophy, science, and the mysteries they could only guess at. It was during this time that they became acquainted with Lord Byron, whose presence added a new spark to their quiet circle. Byron was bold, dramatic, and endlessly intriguing, a stark contrast to the calm Mary often carried within herself, yet he brought with him a sense of possibility that stirred something new in her mind. Their evenings with Byron were filled with gentle debates, ghost stories, and reflections on the strange wonders of nature. On rainy nights, when the world outside seemed wrapped in a soft grey veil, they would sit near the dim glow of candlelight discussing the boundaries of life, the reach of human understanding, and the mysteries that lingered just beyond sight. Mary listened more often than she spoke, absorbing the shifting energy of these gatherings, letting thoughts settle quietly and grow. She didn't know it yet, but these moments, these slow, reflective nights by the lake, filled with calm conversation and drifting ideas, were laying the earliest threads of what would become the story that would define her legacy. Even as storms rolled over the lake and thunder echoed across the mountains, Mary felt strangely at peace, unknowingly preparing for the night when imagination, fear, and inspiration would meet in a single spark that would change her life forever. The summer they spent near Lake Geneva unfolded with a quiet, haunting beauty, the kind that settled gently into the corners of memory even as it was happening, and Mary found herself drifting deeper into a reflective calm that seemed to shape every thought she held. The days were often overcast, the sky layered in muted grey tones that softened the edges of the mountains, and the evenings brought cool winds that rustled through the trees like distant whispers. Mary spent many hours watching the lake stretch out before her, its surface shifting between stillness and subtle ripples, and she often felt as though the landscape itself was encouraging her to listen more deeply, to nature, to the silence, and to the stories forming quietly inside her mind. When Lord Byron invited them to join him and his small circle at the Villa Diodati, Mary felt both anticipation and a touch of unease. The villa, perched above the lake, carried an atmosphere that was both grand and slightly eerie, its rooms echoing softly as though holding on to memories from another time. Inside, candles burned late into the night, their flames trembling against the walls, while shadows moved gently in the corners like sleeping thoughts waiting to be stirred. The group, Byron, Percy, John Polidori and Mary, often gathered in the spacious parlour, where the stormy weather outside pushed them towards storytelling. Byron, dramatic and effortlessly captivating, enjoyed provoking discussions about the unknown, and Polidori contributed with a deep fascination for the strange side of human nature. Percy, with his restless curiosity, often shifted from philosophy to science, weaving together ideas about life, electricity, and the possibility of forces yet undiscovered. Mary mostly listened, letting their voices blend with the sound of rain tapping steadily against the windows. Every now and then someone would pose a question about fear, or the limits of human power, or the fragile space between creation and destruction, and these thoughts drifted into Mary's mind like sparks seeking tinder. One evening, after a long stretch of stormy weather that wrapped the lake in heavy mist, Byron proposed a new activity. Each person was to create a ghost story, something imagined purely from the depths of their own fears and curiosities. The challenge was meant in good spirits, yet to Mary it felt like an invitation into an interior space she had not yet fully explored. Over the next few nights, the villa was filled with a kind of quiet tension, as though the atmosphere itself waited for something to emerge. Polidori wrote intensely, Byron drafted dramatic fragments, Percy paced restlessly through the halls, and Mary sat quietly, feeling a weight she could not explain, as though her story was already forming somewhere in the shadows of her mind. But nothing came, not at first. Night after night, Mary felt ideas drift near her, then fade away before she could grasp them. She worried that she had nothing to offer, that perhaps her imagination was not ready to step into the light alongside the others, and yet she did not force it. She let the quiet guide her, trusting that something would arrive in its own time. Then, one night, after hours spent listening to Byron and Polidori debate the mysteries of life itself, how the line between what is animate and what is not might be thinner than anyone realizes, Mary finally slept, and in that sleep a dream came to her with vivid clarity, a pale student kneeling beside a figure that stirred under his touch, a being assembled from still, silent parts, suddenly awakening under a powerful spark, its eyes opening with a look of anguished, fragile life. Mary woke with her heart trembling, the dream clinging to her like a cold mist. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, the soft, haunting birth of an image, was the beginning of the creature who would echo across centuries, a creature born not from horror, but from a quiet, contemplative summer night by the lake. Mary woke the next morning with the remnants of her dream still clinging to her thoughts, lingering in a way that felt different from ordinary imagination, as though the images had settled not just in her mind, but somewhere deeper, where ideas carried weight and intention. She moved through the early hours quietly, listening to the soft sounds of the villa waking around her, the creak of distant floorboards, the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway, the muted hum of wind brushing gently against the windows. Percy noticed her silence but didn't press her. He sensed the delicate state of inspiration and allowed her space, trusting that whatever had taken root within her needed time to unfold. Mary walked outside for a moment, letting the cool morning air settle over her skin as she looked out across Lake Geneva. its surface calm and pale beneath the lingering mist. She replayed the dream in her mind, the trembling figure, the spark of unnatural life, the expression on the creature's face, a mixture of confusion, fear, and an almost heartbreaking innocence. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the story was not about terror, but about the fragile line between creation and responsibility, about the loneliness that follows when someone is brought into a world that doesn't know how to hold them. By midday, she returned to the parlour where Byron and Polidori were already deep in conversation, their voices rising and falling like waves. Byron asked if she'd made progress on her ghost story, his tone half playful, half curious, and Mary offered a small, thoughtful smile as she answered that she believed she finally had something worth exploring. She didn't describe the dream in full. Instead, she held it close, shaping its edges internally, feeling it grow more complete with every quiet breath. Later, when Percy joined her near the large window overlooking the lake, Mary began to share pieces of the idea, not as a finished story, but as a soft unfolding of thoughts. She spoke of humanity's desire to reach beyond its natural limits, of the consequences that come when ambition outruns compassion, and of the being at the centre of it all, a creature born into isolation, made by hands that did not consider the weight of their actions. Percy listened with wonder, recognizing the depth of Mary's emerging vision. He encouraged her to pursue it, not with urgency, but with a gentle confidence that she could shape something profound if she simply trusted her instincts. That night, Mary sat by candlelight, letting the quiet of the villa guide her pen. She wrote slowly at first, choosing each word with care, letting the atmosphere of the stormy evening seep into the tone of her storytelling. The creature was not yet fully formed, nor was the scientist who created him, but the essence of their connection, their shared tragedy, began to take shape like shadows gathering definition. As the candle flickered low, Mary realized that her dream had given her more than a simple chilling vision. It had offered her a doorway into a story about life, longing, and the delicate boundaries of human desire. She felt calm, almost serene as she wrote, unaware that these quiet moments were the first steps into a legacy that would shape literature for generations. Mary continued shaping her story with a quiet, steady rhythm, letting each new thought settle gently before guiding it onto the page, and as the days drifted by, she felt herself slipping deeper into the world she was creating, almost as though it existed beside her, waiting patiently for her to uncover its details. She imagined the scientist first, not as a villain, but as a young man driven by curiosity and a longing to understand the mysteries that had always seemed beyond reach. She pictured him studying late into the night, his mind filled with questions about life and nature, questions that were both beautiful and dangerous in their ambition. She understood that his desire to create something extraordinary came not from cruelty, but from a profound yearning to grasp the secrets of existence. And then came the creature, the being who emerged from her dream, not monstrous in essence, but profoundly alone, awakened into a world that did not welcome him. Mary spent long hours imagining what it must feel like to open one's eyes for the first time and see nothing familiar, no comforting presence, no gentle reassurance, only the weight of existence and the confusion of being born into fear. This emotional foundation became the quiet heartbeat of her unfolding narrative. During the afternoons, she often walked along the shoreline of Lake Geneva, listening to the gentle lapping of water against stone. The landscape, with its shifting clouds and the distant call of birds, became a backdrop for her thoughts. She observed how the lake could be calm one moment and restless the next, and she found a strange parallel between its moods and the inner world of her imagined creature. Sometimes she paused to watch the reflections on the water, distorted shapes of mountains and sky, and wondered whether the creature too would struggle to understand his place in the world, seeing only a fragmented version of himself mirrored in the reactions of those he encountered. In the evenings, when storms gathered over the mountains and lightning illuminated the darkness, Mary felt her story deepen. She imagined the scene of creation not as a spectacle of horror, but as a moment where the boundary between life and death flickered like a candle in the wind. She pictured the scientist's trembling hands, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the fragile anticipation that something extraordinary might emerge from his efforts. She sensed the weight of responsibility he did not anticipate, the guilt that would follow, and the sorrow that would linger inside the creature who sought nothing more than understanding. Percy watched her progress with admiration, offering gentle encouragement and engaging her in thoughtful discussions about science and ethics. He never pushed her to write faster or differently. Instead, he supported her curiosity, recognizing that her story was growing not from pressure, but from reflection. Byron, too, expressed interest, though in his own dramatic way, often asking about the creature's nature or the theme of human ambition, prompting Mary to consider new angles she had not yet explored. But through it all, the writing remained deeply personal, shaped by the quiet spaces Mary created for herself. She sensed that her story was becoming something more than a ghost tale. It was evolving into a meditation on what it means to bring something into the world without understanding the consequences, and how even the gentlest intentions can lead to unexpected sorrow. As the summer progressed, she felt increasingly certain that she was meant to write this story, not because others expected it, but because it had found a home inside her, asking to be born with the same fragile urgency she imagined in her creature's awakening. And with every page she filled, Mary felt herself moving closer to the voice that would define her legacy, unaware of how deeply her creation would echo through time. Mary's writing entered a new phase as summer deepened around the lake, the air growing warmer during the day and cooler at night, creating a rhythm that seemed to guide her thoughts with gentle precision. She no longer hesitated before sitting down to write. Instead, she felt a pull toward her notebook each morning, a quiet invitation from the world she was building. The scientist and the creature were becoming clearer, no longer abstract shapes, but beings with inner lives, emotions and silent burdens. Mary sensed that the power of the story lay not in the shock of creation, but in the fragile moments that followed it, the moments where choices shaped destinies. She spent long hours refining the scientist's motivations, imagining him as someone brilliant yet flawed, a young man who believed he could bridge the distance between knowledge and nature. She pictured him moving through dimly lit laboratories, surrounded by instruments whose purposes he barely understood, yet trusted with an almost hopeful desperation. She understood that his greatest mistake would not be creating life, but abandoning it in fear, unable to accept the responsibility for what he had done. And then there was the creature, whose presence in Mary's imagination grew more distinct each day. She imagined him exploring the world with childlike wonder, learning through observation, feeling deeply yet unable to express those feelings in ways others could understand. He was not evil, she decided, but misunderstood, shaped by rejection, moulded by loneliness, and driven by a desperate longing for connection. These emotional threads became the quiet foundation of her work. In the evenings, the group at the villa continued their discussions, though the atmosphere had changed. Polydori had finished his own tale, Byron had moved on to new ideas, and Percy remained fascinated by the science behind Mary's story, offering thoughts about electricity, anatomy, and the possibility, suggested by recent experiments, that life might be rekindled under certain conditions. Mary listened, taking in every detail, but she never allowed the story to become purely technical. For her, the heart of the tale lived in the spaces between science and sorrow, creation and consequence. Outside, the weather remained unpredictable. Some days the lake was calm, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the mountains with perfect clarity. Other days storms rolled across the sky with sudden force, thunder echoing against the hills. Mary often paused during her writing to watch the clouds gather, finding that the shifting light helped her imagine the emotional landscape of her characters. She wrote about the scientist's fear as he realized what he had done, the creature's first wandering steps into a world that had no place for him, and the aching distance that grew between creation and creator. As these ideas deepened, Mary began to notice how much of her own life echoed through the story. She understood loss, the ache of absence, the quiet struggle to find belonging. She understood the power of imagination to mend the spaces grief left behind. These reflections shaped her writing in ways she never spoke aloud, giving the narrative a tenderness that surprised even her. By the time August approached, Mary's pages had grown thick with careful lines of ink, each one a testament to the steady voice she was discovering within herself. The story no longer felt like something she was trying to create. It felt like something she was uncovering, as though it already existed somewhere just beyond sight, waiting for her to bring it into the world with patience and compassion. And with every evening that passed, Mary grew more certain that her quiet work by the lake was becoming something significant, something far larger than the ghost story Byron had originally proposed. As August settled gently over Switzerland, Mary felt her world narrowing in a comforting way, as though her thoughts, the villa, and the quiet lake had formed a small universe devoted entirely to the unfolding of her story. The days blended softly into each other, marked only by changes in light, weather, and the steady progress of her writing. She often woke early, when the sky was still pale and calm, and stepped outside to breathe in the cool air drifting off the lake. These moments of solitude helped her slip easily back into the emotional current of her characters. She imagined the creature awakening to a world that felt cold and unfamiliar, rising from stillness into confusion. She pictured him reaching out instinctively, yearning for a touch that never came. This loneliness became a central thread Mary followed with great care, recognizing that the creature's fear was not born from malice, but from the profound emptiness of being rejected at the moment of birth. During her walks, Mary reflected on the scientist's inner turmoil as well. She envisioned him as a young man overwhelmed by his own brilliance, unable to face the result of his ambition. She imagined him pacing through dark corridors, haunted by the knowledge that he had crossed a boundary he was never meant to approach. His retreat from the creature was not an act of hatred, she realized, but one of panic, a fragile human response to the fear of the unknown. These emotional complexities guided Mary's writing more than any scientific detail. In the afternoons, when sunlight warmed the surface of the lake, she sometimes drifted into thoughtful silence, turning over the ethical questions at the heart of her narrative. What does it mean to create? What does one owe to that creation? She understood that the tension between responsibility and fear would shape the soul of her story. Evenings at the villa remained lively, though Mary's mind often wandered back to her growing tale. Byron shared new ideas for poems. Polidori occasionally read aloud fragments of his own work, and Percy, ever restless, debated philosophy with an intensity that filled the room. Yet Mary contributed more quietly now, offering brief thoughts while keeping most of her creative energy focused inward. Her companions noticed her focus but respected it, sensing that she was nurturing something delicate and significant. Sometimes, after long discussions, Mary returned to her room feeling inspired by the interplay of their ideas. She might sit by the window, watching lightning flicker behind distant clouds, and imagine how the creature would respond to the same storm, frightened, curious, or comforted by the patterns of nature. These small reflections helped shape scenes that felt emotionally true. As her pages multiplied, Mary found herself deeply attached to both the scientist and the creature, understanding them not as opposites, but as reflections of each other. One driven by ambition, the other shaped by abandonment. Their intertwined fates revealed something universal about longing, fear, and the human desire for connection. By the end of the month, Mary's confidence had grown quietly. She sensed that her story was expanding beyond the bounds of a simple ghost tale. It was becoming a meditation on creation, loneliness, and the fragile bonds that tie beings together. and as she dipped her pen into ink each night, she felt a calm certainty. This story was hers to tell, and she would follow it wherever it led. As summer began to fade into early autumn, Mary found herself writing with a steadier flow, her thoughts settling more easily onto the page as though the story itself was guiding her hand. The atmosphere around Lake Geneva shifted subtly, the air turning cooler in the mornings and the mountains taking on deeper shades of blue and grey. Mary felt the change like a quiet signal that her own narrative was entering a new phase, one shaped by deeper emotion and a clearer understanding of the world she was creating. She spent many afternoons contemplating the creature's early experiences, imagining how he would perceive the world through senses unburdened by memory. She pictured him wandering through forests, observing the rustle of leaves, the warmth of sunlight, and the chill of night with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. These scenes allowed Mary to explore the gentleness she believed existed within him, a kind of innocence untouched by judgment. She wrote about his attempts to mimic the sounds of birds, his fascination with the movement of water, and his early efforts to understand the concept of warmth. Each moment she imagined carried a tenderness that surprised her, revealing the depth of her empathy for this being who had never been meant to exist. At the same time, Mary explored the scientist's unravelling state of mind. She envisioned him returning to his studies with a forced calm, attempting to bury the memory of what he had created. Yet the guilt remained, lingering in every room he entered and every silence he encountered. Mary sensed that the scientist's fear came from within, a fear not of the creature itself, but of the part of himself that had dared to challenge the natural order. She wrote about his restless nights, filled with dreams that blurred the boundary between creation and responsibility, and his futile attempts to convince himself that the creature would simply disappear. These dual narratives, one of discovery, the other of denial, formed a quiet rhythm that shaped Mary's pages. Percy noticed her deepening focus, and sometimes asked gentle questions about her progress, though he never pushed. He knew that Mary's creativity worked like the lake's surface, calm on the outside, but with currents moving steadily beneath. Byron remained curious as well, occasionally prompting her with dramatic suggestions, though Mary took only what resonated with her theme of emotional truth. Even Polidori, who had a more clinical fascination with the supernatural, seemed intrigued by the philosophical direction her story was taking. Occasionally, Mary paused to reflect on how her own experiences had shaped her perspective. She thought about the absence of her mother, the emotional distance with her father, and the longing for understanding she had felt throughout her life. These memories, though rarely spoken aloud, slipped quietly into her writing, giving her narrative a depth that echoed her own journey through loss and hope. As the weeks passed, Mary felt her characters becoming more defined, their fates more intertwined. She realised that the creature's loneliness would push him to seek connection, while the scientist's fear would drive him further away. This tension, this tragic imbalance, felt essential to the story's heart. She knew that the creature would eventually learn language, observe human society, and form a complex understanding of the world. But she also sensed that no matter how much knowledge he gained, he would remain marked by the moment of his creation, tethered to a loneliness he could not escape. Mary understood that this pain, quiet and profound, would guide his choices and shape the path of the story. By early September, Mary's manuscript had grown significantly. She read over her pages late at night, listening to the soft rhythm of Percy's breathing beside her, and felt a calm certainty settle over her. She wasn't just writing a ghost story. She was building a tale about existence, longing, and the fragile ties that bind creator and creation. And as she dipped her pen into ink once more, she knew her story still had many quiet depths to uncover. As September deepened, Mary felt the story unfolding with a calm inevitability, as though each scene had been waiting patiently for her to arrive. The villa had grown quieter, the lively evenings of midsummer giving way to a gentler routine. Polidori withdrew into his own work, Byron drifted between moods, and Percy spent long hours walking near the lake, leaving Mary with pockets of stillness that allowed her imagination to settle more deeply. She returned often to the creature's journey, imagining him moving quietly through the forest as he learned to understand the world by watching it closely. She pictured him slowing his steps when he heard birdsong, fascinated by the delicate patterns of sound. She imagined him touching the bark of trees, feeling the difference between rough and smooth textures, noticing how sunlight filtered softly through leaves and warmed the ground in scattered patches. In these quiet details, Mary found the emotional core of her story, an exploration of wonder that made the creature feel painfully alive. She wrote about his first attempts to seek shelter, his discovery of fire, and the sting of its heat against his skin. She imagined him startled by his own reflection in a pool of water, unsure whether the face staring back belonged to someone else, or to a being he could not yet understand. These moments allowed Mary to shape him not as a monster, but as a fragile, newly awakened soul searching for meaning. At the same time, she turned her thoughts to the scientist, whose life was unravelling slowly. She pictured him wandering through crowded streets, trying to lose himself in the noise of the city, yet unable to escape the image of the creature's first breath. She imagined him waking suddenly at night, drenched in sweat, convinced he heard footsteps behind him. His fear was not irrational, Mary realised. It was the fear of someone who had reached too far into the mysteries of life and now grasped the weight of his actions. Mary found herself deeply absorbed in exploring the emotional consequences of ambition. She understood how easily the pursuit of knowledge could slip into obsession, and how easily obsession could lead to regret. These reflections shaped her writing with a tender precision she had not expected when the story first came to her. As the weeks passed, Mary's companions began to sense the depth of her commitment. Percy sometimes brought her tea in the afternoons, setting it quietly beside her without interrupting her thoughts. Byron asked fewer questions now, recognising that her creative world had become a space she needed to protect. Polidori observed her progress with a more distant curiosity, though even he seemed aware that her story was growing into something rare. Mary herself felt the shift. She knew she was writing something that mattered, not only to her companions but to her own sense of purpose. She felt a quiet strength in shaping a narrative where tenderness and terror intertwined, forming a reflection of the mysteries she had carried in her heart since childhood. By the end of September, Mary's manuscript had reached a turning point. She could see where the story was heading, though many details still hovered at the edge of her imagination. She sensed conflict approaching, loss taking shape, and the fragile hopes of her characters tightening like threads pulled by unseen hands. Yet she didn't rush. She let the story breathe, trusting that each scene would reveal itself in its own time. And as she sat near the window one evening, watching the last glow of sunlight fade behind the mountains, Mary felt something new, an awareness that this quiet work had become a part of her, a reflection of her deepest questions about life, creation, and the longing to be understood. As October approached, the air around the lake grew colder, carrying a faint sharpness that signalled the slow shift toward autumn, and Mary found the changing season mirroring the turn her story was beginning to take. The gentle curiosity that had shaped the creature's early experiences now evolved into something more complex, more burdened, and Mary followed this transition with careful, deliberate steps. She imagined the creature watching a small family in a cottage from a hidden place among the trees, observing their daily routines with growing fascination. The father chopping wood, the mother tending quietly to tasks near the hearth, the young daughter humming softly as she arranged simple flowers in a bowl. These scenes filled the creature with a yearning he could not name. Mary wrote of his attempts to mimic the family's actions, practicing gestures in the forest as though preparing for a life he wished he could join. She imagined him collecting firewood and leaving it secretly by their door at night, hoping they might see it as a gift. a small offering of connection. In these quiet acts, Mary captured the essence of his loneliness, a longing woven so gently into her narrative that it felt almost whispered. Meanwhile, the scientist's world continued to unravel. Mary imagined him wandering through libraries and lecture halls, trying to reclaim the sense of purpose he once carried so confidently. Yet every time he opened a book or attempted to resume his research, he felt a tremor of guilt that unsettled him. She wrote of his attempts to convince himself that the creature had vanished into the wilderness, that his responsibility had ended, even though he knew the truth lingered behind every thought. He had created a being he had not the courage to guide. Mary explored the emotional distance growing within him, the heavy silence that followed him wherever he went. She imagined him avoiding familiar streets, withdrawing from conversations, and feeling a quiet dread in moments when the world around him fell too still. These reflections allowed her to show how fragile and human he truly was. During this time, Mary spent more hours than ever writing, sometimes losing track of time as the candle beside her burned low. Percy would check on her occasionally, asking softly if she needed anything, but she usually shook her head, thankful for his gentle presence but unwilling to break the delicate thread of concentration. Byron noticed her dedication as well, though he remained more distant, occasionally pacing the villa with his own restless energy, while Mary continued shaping her story with calm determination. Mary also found herself reflecting on her own life as she wrote. She thought of her mother, of the legacy she carried without ever having known her, and of the strength she had always sought quietly within herself. These memories shaped the tenderness with which she approached the creature's perspective, giving his journey a depth that reflected her own search for belonging. She understood his longing because she had felt her own version of it, a desire to be seen, to be understood, to find a place where one's inner world felt welcome. By mid-October, Mary sensed that the story was heading toward a darker turn. She knew the creature's hope would eventually collide with the harsh reality of human fear, and that the scientist's denial would lead him toward consequences he could no longer escape. Yet Mary did not rush to reach that moment. Instead, she allowed each scene to unfold slowly, carefully, embracing the quiet sorrow growing at the edges of the narrative. And as she wrote late into the night, listening to the wind move softly through the trees outside the villa, she felt once again the profound serenity that came when imagination and emotion aligned so perfectly that the story seemed to write itself. As autumn settled fully around Lake Geneva, Mary felt her story pulling her into a deeper, more solemn emotional terrain, as though the changing season had opened a quieter passage within her imagination. The leaves turned shades of amber and muted gold, drifting gently across the garden paths, and Mary often paused during her walks to watch them fall, sensing that the world itself was mirroring the shift in her narrative. She continued exploring the creature's growing awareness, imagining him not only observing the cottage family but slowly piecing together the meaning behind their gestures, their expressions, and their soft, affectionate routines. Mary wrote about the tenderness he felt when watching them share a simple meal, the warmth that filled the room as the daughter read aloud, and the comfort that seemed to settle between them during the quiet moments of evening. The creature, Mary decided, was learning not just language, but humanity, an understanding shaped not by instruction but by longing. She imagined him repeating words softly to himself, practicing them with care as he hid among the trees, determined to speak one day with grace and hope. She described his joy when he realized he could understand fragments of their conversations, the pride he felt when his mind grasped meaning from sound. But Mary also felt the ache of his isolation deepening. She wrote of the creature watching his own reflection again, struggling to reconcile the gentle thoughts inside him with the appearance the world would fear. She let the sadness settle quietly in her writing, allowing it to guide the slow transition from innocence toward awareness. Meanwhile, Mary imagined the scientist travelling farther from home, hoping that distance could ease the weight within him. She pictured him seeking distraction in new surroundings, walking along unfamiliar roads, attempting to bury himself in the rhythms of daily life. Yet no matter how far he went, Mary sensed that he carried the memory of creation like a shadow that stretched behind him. She wrote of his attempts to convince himself that the past could be left behind, but she allowed small details, a tremor in his hands, a moment of sudden dread, a feeling of being watched, to reveal that his denial was fragile. Mary also spent time refining the emotional threads that connected the scientist and the creature. She understood that neither character existed without the other, bound by forces neither of them fully understood. As she wrote, she often found herself lingering on the theme of responsibility, how it grows quietly, how it cannot be escaped, how it shapes the soul. During the evenings at the villa, while others debated literature or recited fragments of their work, Mary drifted deeper into her thoughts. She would listen to the rain tapping gently at the windows, feeling the soft presence of her characters moving within her, guiding her hand whenever she returned to her manuscript. Percy noticed how absorbed she'd become, yet he never questioned her. He simply brought her warmth, tea, blankets, quiet reassurance, trusting that she was following a path meant for her. Mary found comfort in these small gestures, though she rarely voiced just how much they steadied her. By late October, Mary sensed the inevitable shift approaching in her story. She knew the creature would soon attempt to reveal himself to the cottage family, believing, naively, tenderly, that the kindness he observed would be extended to him. She knew too that the world he longed for was not ready to receive him. The sorrow of this truth weighed on Mary, but she approached it with a calm, deliberate patience, recognizing that heartbreak was woven into the creature's fate. And as the nights grew longer and the chill outside deepened, she continued writing by candlelight, her thoughts moving gently across the page, shaping a narrative that was becoming not only a story of creation, but a meditation on the quiet tragedies and fragile hopes that linger within every heart. As October deepened into its colder, quieter days, Mary felt her story approaching a moment she had both anticipated and gently resisted, knowing the creature's hope was about to collide with a reality he could not understand. She spent long hours imagining the lead-up to that moment, shaping each detail with quiet care. She pictured him gathering the courage to step out from the shadows, rehearsing greetings he had practiced softly among the trees, believing with pure sincerity that kindness could be earned through gentle actions and patient observation. Mary described how he waited for the perfect moment, choosing a morning when the air felt calm and the light softened the world in pale gold. She imagined him approaching the cottage slowly, carrying a bundle of wood he had collected as a final gift to the family he admired. His heart, she wrote, held a trembling mixture of anticipation and fear, warmed by the belief that affection could be built through effort, and unaware of the pain about to shape him forever. Meanwhile, Mary turned her attention to the family's perspective, imagining the daughter humming as she worked, the mother preparing a simple meal, the father stepping outside for a moment of fresh air. She crafted their reactions with delicate restraint, understanding that fear often rises not from malice but from surprise, from the sudden rupture of what feels familiar. Mary wrote of the father seeing the creature first, his expression shifting instantly from confusion to alarm, his voice rising sharply in panic. She imagined the creature stopping in his tracks, stunned by the response, unable to understand how the love he had quietly offered could transform so quickly into terror. The rejection, Mary realized, would shape the creature's heart more deeply than any physical wound. She described his retreat into the forest, stumbling through leaves and tangled roots as a heavy sorrow settled over him. He would hide near the lake that night, she wrote, trying to recreate the comfort he had once felt simply by watching the family. But now their laughter, once warm to him, echoed painfully in his memory. Mary allowed this sorrow to guide her writing, shaping the creature's growing awareness that he stood apart from the world not by choice, but by nature. During this shift in the narrative, Mary often paused, sensing the emotional weight of what she was creating. She understood loneliness intimately, though hers had been quieter, shaped by loss rather than fear. She poured that understanding into the creature's thoughts, letting his grief settle with a quiet depth that made his next path feel tragically inevitable. At the same time, Mary imagined the scientist far from these events, unaware of the heartbreak unfolding because of his absence. She pictured him writing letters he never sent, avoiding questions he never answered, drifting through days with a hollow kind of resolve. She wrote of his attempts to distract himself with travel, yet always sensing some invisible thread pulling him back toward the creature he had abandoned. By the end of October, Mary sensed that her story had reached a turning point. The creature's innocence had cracked, and the scientist's denial could no longer stretch thin enough to hold. Yet Mary didn't rush into the darker parts ahead. She let the tension settle quietly, giving space for sorrow to breathe. And as she wrote late into the night, she felt the story deepening into something more profound than she had intended. A reflection on rejection, responsibility, and the fragile ache of wanting to belong. As November settled in with its muted skies and colder winds, Mary found herself writing with a heavier, more contemplative rhythm, aware that her story had entered a chapter shaped by sorrow rather than discovery. The creature's rejection lingered in her thoughts long after she set her pen down each night, and she carried his loneliness with her during quiet walks along the lake. She imagined him wandering deeper into the forest after that painful encounter, seeking places where his sadness could sink unnoticed into the earth. Mary wrote of how he replayed the moment again and again, trying to understand what had gone wrong. He had offered kindness. He had offered help. Why had it been met with fear? This confusion became a central part of his emotional shift, a quiet breaking that Mary described with careful restraint. She pictured him observing the world with a new sense of distance, noticing how freely affection flowed among humans yet never extended toward him. He watched families gather by warm fires, friends greet each other with familiar laughter, travellers share meals and stories. Each time he witnessed these small gestures of connection, the ache within him deepened, shaping his understanding of what he had lost. Mary also explored the creature's growing intelligence. She imagined him finding discarded books and learning to read slowly, sounding out each word with determination. Through these pages he discovered stories of heroes, outcasts, lovers and explorers. He learned of virtue and cruelty, of justice and revenge, and Mary allowed these lessons to build quietly inside him, each one shaping the moral landscape he struggled to create for himself. Yet the more he learned about humanity, the more he realized how far he stood from it. Meanwhile, Mary returned to the scientist's journey, imagining him receiving letters from home, reminders of responsibilities he'd abandoned. She pictured him sitting alone in dim rooms, reading news of friends, of family events, of ordinary life continuing without him. Each letter carried a quiet weight, nudging him toward the realization that he could not escape what he had left behind. Mary wrote of his growing sense of dread, the way his thoughts drifted reluctantly back to the creature, the guilt that surfaced in moments when he expected peace. She imagined him pacing restlessly in the evenings, knowing he must eventually return, yet feeling unprepared for the consequences waiting for him. Mary found a quiet balance in these parallel narratives. The creature's loneliness and the scientist's avoidance were shaping the same emotional landscape, two diverging paths slowly bending toward collision. She understood that this tension would soon lead to the next turning point in her story, one that required patience to approach with care. During this period, Mary herself felt a deeper connection to her work. She often paused to watch the lake in the late afternoon light, noticing how its surface reflected the dimming sky in muted shades of silver and grey. She felt the same stillness settling over her as she wrote, guiding her through the painful parts of the story with a calm sense of purpose. By mid-November, Mary sensed that the creature's sorrow was beginning to transform into something sharper, an awareness that hope, no matter how sincerely held, could break under the weight of rejection. Yet she continued writing with tenderness, refusing to let anger define him too quickly. She let the sadness linger, shaping him slowly, allowing him to become a being shaped not by cruelty, but by deep, unfulfilled longing. And as she dipped her pen into ink each evening, Mary felt the story carrying her forward into its darker, more complex depths, a path she followed quietly, trusting that each step would reveal the next. As November continued with its cold mornings and long muted evenings, Mary felt the narrative shifting once again, drawing her deeper into the emotional storm forming within the creature. She understood that sorrow, when left alone long enough, begins to reshape itself into something heavier, and she approached this transition with a quiet, deliberate care. She imagined the creature wandering into more distant parts of the forest, choosing paths where even the soft rustle of animals seemed scarce, seeking isolation as a way to understand the growing weight in his chest. Mary wrote of him remembering the cottage family, the warmth of their interactions, the gentleness of their routines, the comfort he had once hoped to join, and how each memory now brought a sting of pain. She described him touching the pieces of wood he once collected for them, feeling the familiar texture beneath his hands, yet now sensing only grief in the gesture. These reflections, Mary knew, were shaping the creature's understanding of the world far more deeply than any words in the books he found. She imagined him returning to the cottage at night, not to offer help, but to watch from afar, hoping for some sign that they might accept him if he approached again. But each time he saw the father glance nervously over his shoulder, or heard the girl speak in hushed tones about the mysterious figure in the woods, he felt himself shrinking away, realizing that their fear would never soften into kindness. Meanwhile, Mary turned her attention to the scientist, imagining him preparing reluctantly to return home after weeks of uneasy travel. She pictured him standing at the edge of a harbour, watching the cold water shift beneath the boat that would take him back, feeling the weight of unfinished responsibilities tightening around him like a quiet fog. She wrote of his hesitation, the way he lingered on the dock, imagining what might await him. Would the creature still be near? Had it survived? Had it found him? These questions unsettled him, and Mary allowed that discomfort to reveal how deeply his guilt had settled into his thoughts. She imagined him boarding the boat with unsteady resolve, carrying with him letters from friends urging his return, unaware that the consequences he feared were already taking shape. Mary's writing often paused during these scenes, her hand hovering above the page as she considered the fragile emotional threads between creator and creation. She reflected on how fear could blind even the most capable mind, and how avoidance could transform small mistakes into quiet tragedies. These reflections guided her deeper into the next stage of the story. As November drew on, Mary sensed that the creature's longing was beginning to bend into a different emotion. Not anger, but a quiet questioning of his own worth. She imagined him wondering why he had been made at all, why life had been given to him without guidance or affection. She wrote of him sitting near the edge of a frozen stream, watching his reflection ripple beneath a thin layer of ice, struggling to understand the purpose of his existence. This scene, Mary realized, held a profound sadness she felt compelled to explore. She described his soft attempts to speak to himself, repeating words he had learned, trying to find comfort in their familiar shapes. Yet each word echoed hollowly in the cold air, offering no reassurance. During her late-night writing sessions, Mary often paused to gaze at the candlelight flickering across her desk, sensing the emotional heaviness of her story, but embracing it with calm determination. She understood that these passages were not merely dark, they were essential, revealing the quiet depths of loneliness that had shaped her creature from the moment he opened his eyes. By the end of the month, Mary felt the next turning point drawing near. The creature's sorrow was nearing its breaking point, and the scientist's return would soon anchor their fates once more. Yet Mary continued writing gently, letting the emotional threads tighten at their own pace, trusting the story to lead her where it needed to go. As November slipped quietly toward winter, Mary felt the tone of her story tightening, the emotional distance between the creature and the scientist shrinking like breath on cold glass. The world around Lake Geneva grew starker, the trees bare, the wind sharper, and Mary sensed the same chill settling into her narrative. She imagined the creature wandering through the forest as the first thin frost formed on branches, his steps slower now, his thoughts heavier. He no longer approached the cottage, though he often stood at a distance, watching the family through dim light and remembering the hope he once carried. Mary wrote of how he tried to comfort himself by recalling their gentle voices, their warm gestures, their simple routines, but each memory now felt like a reminder of something forever beyond his reach. She described him seeking shelter in a shallow cave at night, curling his body against the cold as he replayed the scene of rejection over and over, trying to understand why kindness had led him only to fear. She imagined him pressing his hands against the cold earth, feeling its stillness, searching for meaning where none was easily offered. Meanwhile, Mary returned to the scientist's journey home. She pictured him stepping off a small boat onto familiar soil, feeling the weight of returning settle heavily on his shoulders. Mary wrote of his cautious walk through the streets, the way he kept glancing behind him, sensing shadows where there were none. His guilt, she realized, had grown into a quiet companion, always present, always whispering. She imagined his family welcoming him back with relief, unaware of the turmoil he carried. Mary described how he forced a smile, how he tried to appear unchanged, though his eyes betrayed sleepless nights and a mind that refused peace. As he settled into his old life, Mary showed how his thoughts grew restless. He tried to study again, to regain the discipline that once defined him, but each attempt collapsed under the weight of the memory he avoided. She wrote of him waking at night to imagine sounds, convinced the creature might have found him. These scenes allowed Mary to explore the fragile nature of denial, and she shaped them with quiet precision. At the same time, she deepened the creature's inner world. She imagined him discovering the remains of a burned-out campfire left by travelling strangers, and how the warmth of the ashes reminded him of the fleeting comfort he once hoped to find among humans. She wrote of his attempts to imitate the gentle gestures he had seen, lifting a small bird that had fallen from its nest, arranging branches to protect it. But these acts only reminded him of his own lack of belonging. Mary also imagined him watching travellers pass along forest paths, their conversations drifting toward him in fragments. Some spoke of harsh winters, others of family gatherings, others of ordinary hopes and worries. These voices, Mary wrote, became a haunting chorus to the creature, proof that humans move through a world of connection while he remained outside its edges. By late November, Mary sensed the emotional turning point approaching. She felt the creature's sorrow sharpening, transforming into something that would no longer allow him to remain hidden. She imagined him standing beneath the bare branches one night, looking out at a horizon dimmed by winter light, realizing that his loneliness had grown too large to contain. She wrote of him deciding quietly but firmly that he needed answers, answers from the one who had made him, who had abandoned him, who had given him life without purpose. And as Mary laid down her pen that evening, she knew the next part of her story would draw her characters together once more, their paths converging in ways neither could avoid. As December approached, and winter settled more firmly around the lake, Mary felt her story entering its most delicate emotional territory yet. She sensed the creature's quiet resolve taking shape, a determination born not from anger, but from a deep, aching need for understanding. She imagined him rising before dawn one morning, the forest still wrapped in blue-grey light, frost clinging softly to fallen leaves. His breath drifted pale in the cold air as he stood still for a long moment, gathering the fragile courage that had taken months to form. Mary described how he turned away from the familiar paths, leaving behind the cave, the forest, and the traces of the life he had tried to build in solitude. Each step, she wrote, felt both heavy and necessary, carrying him toward a fate he could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, Mary turned her attention back to the scientist, imagining him trying to resume a normal life among those who cared for him. She pictured him attending small gatherings, listening to conversations about the coming holidays, offering quiet nods while his mind drifted elsewhere. Mary wrote of how he tried to swallow his guilt, telling himself that the creature must have perished in the wilderness. Yet every quiet evening, every moment when the fire burned low and shadows gathered in the corners of his room, he felt the same uneasy stirring, the sense that something unfinished was drawing nearer. She imagined him waking one night from a troubling dream, his pulse quick and unsteady, convinced for a moment that he saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed. When he blinked, the room returned to stillness, but the dread lingered long after he lay back down. Mary allowed these moments to build slowly, shaping the scientist's growing fear with subtlety rather than sudden shocks. At the same time, she continued developing the creature's internal journey. She imagined him following distant roads cautiously, watching travellers from afar and trying to determine which direction would lead him to the man he sought. Mary wrote of his hesitation each time he approached a village, keeping to the edges where he would not be seen. The sounds of human life, voices, footsteps, laughter, reached him faintly, stirring both longing and pain. She described how he learned to navigate the world with a careful instinct, moving mostly at night, guided by the faint lights of distant towns and the steady pull of his own questions. Mary also allowed the creature moments of quiet reflection during this journey. She imagined him pausing beneath a bare tree to study the moonlight shimmering on frozen branches, wondering if he belonged anywhere beneath the vast, indifferent sky. She wrote of him listening to the distant toll of church bells, recognizing the sound as something connected to humanity, yet feeling it resonate within him in a strangely lonely way. These small scenes helped Mary show that the creature's path toward the scientist was shaped not by rage, but by vulnerability, by the hope that his creator could explain the purpose of his life. Back in her own world, Mary felt a deep connection to these emotional threads. She understood the longing for answers, the desire for belonging, the quiet courage required to confront one's past. These reflections guided her hand as she shaped the next quiet steps of her characters. By mid-December, Mary sensed the moment drawing near, the meeting that would bind their fates once more. She imagined the creature finally reaching the outskirts of the town where the scientist lived, watching from the shadows as warm light spilled from windows and snow drifted gently across the ground. She wrote of him standing alone in the cold, realizing that the man who had given him life was now only a few steps away. And as Mary laid down her pen that night, she felt the quiet tension of the story settle around her, preparing her for the emotional weight of what would come next. As winter deepened and snow began to settle softly across the rooftops of the town, Mary felt the story tightening into a quiet, inevitable meeting. The creature, after so many months of wandering, finally stood at the threshold of the world his creator inhabited. Mary imagined him hidden in the shadows near a narrow street, the muffled sounds of distant conversation drifting toward him through the crisp night air. Warm light spilled from windows, casting gentle shapes across the snow, and each of these small glimpses of human life felt to him like a reminder of the connection he longed for yet had never known. Mary wrote of the creature watching the scientist home from a careful distance, studying the rhythm of people coming and going, learning the patterns of the town so he could remain unseen. She described how he waited patiently for a moment when the scientist would be alone, knowing that the conversation he sought required a quiet space untouched by fear. In these scenes, Mary let the creature's vulnerability guide the tone, his steps slow, his breath unsteady, his thoughts filled with questions he'd carried across forests, mountains, and cold nights. Meanwhile, Mary imagined the scientist continuing to sense an unease he could not name. She wrote of him sitting near the fire one evening, reading without truly absorbing the words, the crackle of flame offering little comfort. Every so often he lifted his head, convinced he heard something beyond the wind, footsteps perhaps, or the faint shifting of snow. Mary described his attempts to dismiss these feelings, to reassure himself that the past remained in the past. Yet each attempt left him more unsettled. She imagined him stepping outside one night, the cold air stinging his skin as he scanned the quiet street for any sign of movement. Nothing greeted him except silence and drifting flakes of snow, yet the heaviness in his chest only grew. Back in her story, Mary let the creature follow these movements from hiding, watching the scientist with a trembling mix of fear and hope. She described how he studied the man's posture, his gestures, trying to understand the person who had shaped his existence yet fled from him in terror. The creature, Mary wrote, felt no desire for vengeance, only a desperate need to be acknowledged, to be told why he had been brought into a world that seemed to reject him at every turn. She imagined him whispering softly to himself, practicing the words he hoped to say when the moment came. Questions, pleas, and perhaps even a small, fragile hope for understanding. As the snow grew deeper around the town, Mary let their worlds inch closer. She wrote of the creature stepping nearer one night, leaving faint imprints in the snow that disappeared into darkness. She imagined him reaching the edge of a lamplit street, his figure concealed just beyond the circle of light, watching the scientist pause in his doorway as though sensing a presence he feared to confront. Mary shaped this scene with a gentle building tension, not dramatic, but quiet and heavy, like breath held between two heartbeats. By the end of the chapter, Mary felt the emotional resonance settling firmly across her manuscript. The creature was no longer just a wanderer, and the scientist was no longer simply a man escaping his past. Their fates were drawing together in a way that felt both heartbreaking and necessary. And as she closed her notebook for the night, Mary sensed that the next pages would finally bring them face to face, in a meeting shaped not by fear, but by the weight of everything unsaid. As the final days of December settled over the town, bringing stillness to the snow-packed streets, Mary felt the story drawing its two silent wanderers toward one another with a gentle, inevitable pull. She imagined the creature watching the scientists home for several nights, waiting for a moment when the house grew quiet, when the light dimmed to a faint glow and the streets outside were empty of passers-by. Mary wrote of the creature standing beneath a pale moon, snow gathering lightly on his shoulders, his breath rising in slow clouds. Every step he took toward the house felt weighted with months of longing, questions, and fragile hope. He had rehearsed his words again and again, shaping them carefully, hoping they might soften the fear he expected to see in his creator's eyes. Inside, Mary imagined the scientist battling a growing discomfort that he could neither name nor calm. She described him pacing the room as the fire burned low, each creak of the floorboards making him pause. He told himself that the unease was nothing more than the chill of winter, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something waited just beyond the door. Mary wrote of him finally sitting down to rest, exhaustion pressing on his eyelids, only for a sudden knock, soft, hesitant, to break the quiet. In this moment, Mary slowed the scene, letting the scientist's heartbeat quicken as he approached the door. She imagined him opening it only slightly at first, the cold air rushing in, carrying with it the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the reach of a light. Mary described the creature lowering his gaze, careful not to startle him, his voice unsteady as he whispered the scientist's name for the first time. The scientist, Mary wrote, felt his breath catch at the sound, fear rising quickly, yet unable to override the shock of hearing words spoken by a being he had once believed incapable of speech. She allowed a long silence to settle between them, a fragile moment where neither moved. Then the creature stepped back slightly, giving space rather than demanding it. Mary wrote his first words with gentle restraint. He did not accuse or demand. Instead, he asked, quietly, painfully, why he had been made. She imagined the scientist struggling to answer, confusion and guilt tightening his thoughts. He had no prepared explanation, no justification that could mend the wounds his silence had created. Mary described his trembling attempt to speak, the way his voice faltered as he confronted the consequence of his ambition. The creature listened, not with anger, but with a longing that cut deeply into the cold night air. Mary allowed the scene to unfold with soft tension. The scientist invited him inside, not from bravery, but from a quiet recognition that he could not turn away again. She imagined them sitting across from each other near the dying fire, the creature explaining his journey, his loneliness, his desire for understanding. The scientist listened with growing sorrow, realizing for the first time how deeply his absence had shaped the being before him. Mary wrote their exchange as a conversation between two souls, one born from longing, the other from regret. And as she brought the scene to a close, she left them seated in that dim room, the fire flickering low, their lives quietly bound together by the fragile beginning of truth. Through the long hours of that winter night, Mary imagined the creature and the scientist sitting together in a fragile quiet, the air between them thick with everything unspoken. She wrote of how the creature, after months of carrying his questions in silence, finally allowed the weight of them to rise. He spoke slowly at first, his voice uneven, shaped by practice and trembling emotion. Mary described how he recounted his earliest memories, the confusion of awakening, the emptiness of being alone, the aching fear when he first looked upon his own reflection. As he spoke, Mary imagined his hands trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the vulnerability of revealing himself. She wrote of the scientist listening with widening eyes, realizing with painful clarity how his absence had shaped every part of the creature's life. The scientist felt each word like a quiet accusation he had never been forced to face. Mary described his struggle to find an explanation, to justify his fear and abandonment, yet every attempt collapsed under the truth of what the creature had endured. She imagined him lowering his gaze, ashamed, unable to meet the creature's eyes as he whispered an apology that felt too small for the suffering it sought to mend. The creature, Mary wrote, accepted the apology not because it erased his loneliness, but because he needed to believe there was meaning in their connection. Mary traced the subtle shift in the room, the fire dimming, shadows growing long, as the creature then asked for something more. He did not ask for love or acceptance from humanity. He asked for companionship, someone who could understand his loneliness, someone who would not fear his appearance. Mary wrote of him explaining with quiet desperation that he wished for another being like himself, not to replace the world that rejected him, but to ease the isolation that had become unbearable. The scientist's reaction, Mary imagined, was a mixture of shock and fear. He recoiled at the thought of repeating his earlier actions, uncertain whether creating another being would mend the damage or multiply it. Mary described the conflict that churned within him, compassion battling dread, responsibility clashing with uncertainty. He hesitated, and Mary let that hesitation stretch into a long silence. The creature watched him closely, Mary wrote, his expression filled with a fragile hope that flickered like the last light of the fire. He did not demand. He pleaded quietly, explaining that without companionship, his suffering would only deepen. Mary crafted this moment with gentle tension, allowing the emotional stakes to settle fully. She imagined the scientist finally nodding, not out of confidence but out of recognition that he owed the creature far more than fear. Mary wrote of him agreeing to consider the request, promising only that he would reflect deeply before giving an answer. This was not the resolution the creature longed for, but it was enough to keep hope alive. As dawn approached, Mary described the creature slipping away before the household awoke, leaving only faint footprints in the snow. The scientist watched from the window, the quiet beginning of remorse stirring within him, And as Mary ended the scene, she allowed both characters to carry the same thought into the new day. Their lives were now bound by a promise that would soon demand far more from each of them than either expected. In the days that followed their quiet meeting, Mary imagined the scientist moving through his home with a heaviness that settled into every corner of his thoughts. The creature's request echoed in his mind with steady persistence, returning each time he tried to focus on anything else. Mary wrote of him pacing the floor late into the night, staring at his hands as though searching for answers in the same fingers that had once created life without understanding its consequences. She described how daylight brought him no relief, how meals tasted hollow, how conversations felt distant, how even familiar rooms seemed dimmed by the weight of the decision he now faced. Meanwhile, Mary envisioned the creature retreating to the edges of the town, finding shelter in a cluster of evergreen trees where snow gathered silently around him. She wrote of him sitting beneath their branches, replaying the scientist's hesitant promise. It was not certainty, but it offered a fragile warmth he had not felt in months. Mary described how he clung to that hope carefully, fearing that too much faith might break him again. She imagined him watching the town from a distance, studying the flicker of candlelight in windows, wondering what it would feel like to sit inside such a room with someone who did not fear him. Mary allowed the creature quiet moments of reflection, moments where he practiced phrases he wanted to say if the scientist kept his promise, moments where he collected small objects from the forest, as if preparing for a future where he would not be alone. Back in the scientist's world, Mary wrote of him visiting laboratories and secluded workspaces he had once avoided, his steps uncertain as he examined tools and instruments that stirred both dread and responsibility. She imagined him running his fingers over dusty tables, remembering the night he had first brought the creature to life and the horror that followed. Mary described the scientist wrestling with the knowledge that he had already crossed a boundary no human should cross. To repeat it felt dangerous, yet to refuse felt cruel. His heart bent beneath the weight of this impossible choice. Mary also explored the emotional complexity building between the two characters. She sensed that the creature's hope was growing more fragile by the day, balanced on the edge of fear that the scientist might ultimately abandon him again. She wrote of the creature wandering deeper into the mountains when the anxiety became too strong, the cold wind carrying his breath in pale, trembling clouds. Yet no matter how far he walked, his thoughts circled back to the same longing, to have someone who could share the world with him. Meanwhile, the scientist avoided giving an answer, fearing that either choice would lead to regret. Mary described him staring out a window during a snowfall, watching flakes drift softly to the ground, as he realized he could no longer leave the creature suspended in uncertainty. His conscience, Mary wrote, had grown louder than his fear. As she shaped the final part of this chapter, Mary described the scientist travelling toward a remote location where he hoped to think clearly, far from the noise of his home, far from the pressure of others' expectations. Yet unknown to him, the creature followed at a distance, unwilling to let the fragile bond between them dissolve. Mary ended the scene with both figures moving through a quiet, snow-covered landscape, their paths drifting toward the same isolated destination, each carrying hopes and fears that would soon shape the next turn of their shared story. As the scientist travelled deeper into the remote landscape, Mary imagined him following narrow paths carved between snow-covered hills, the world around him quiet except for the soft crunch of his boots. He had chosen this isolated place hoping that solitude would offer clarity, yet the silence only magnified the questions he carried. Mary wrote of him stopping often during his journey, staring at the pale sky as though searching for guidance in the drifting clouds. She described him entering a small cabin he occasionally used for study, its wooden walls cold from months of vacancy. He lit a fire, watching it grow slowly, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. The scientist hoped that distance from town might allow him to think without fear pressing at the edges of every thought. But as Mary shaped the scene, she allowed his conscience to follow him even here. Meanwhile, she imagined the creature tracing the scientist's path from a distance. Cautious, yet determined, Mary wrote of him moving silently along forest trails, careful not to leave tracks that might reveal his presence too soon. She described how he paused often, pressing a hand to a tree trunk to steady himself when doubt threatened to overtake him. The scientist's promise had become a fragile thread he could not let go of, and though he feared disappointment, he followed it with a trembling resolve. Mary wrote of the creature reaching the cabin one evening, standing among the pines as smoke drifted upward from the chimney. He watched the warm glow through the window, feeling a pull between the hope of being seen and the fear of being rejected once more. He decided to wait until morning, sitting quietly beneath the trees as snow settled gently on his shoulders. Inside the cabin, Mary described the scientist wrestling with the weight of his choice. He knew creating a companion for the creature could bring unknown consequences, yet refusing him might condemn a sentient being to a lifetime of unbearable loneliness. She imagined him writing notes by candlelight, drafting arguments for both sides and then tearing them apart when neither felt right. He fell asleep at the table, the candle burning low. At dawn, Mary depicted the creature approaching the cabin with hesitant steps, stopping at the door where frost had formed delicate patterns across the wood. He lifted his hand but paused, unsure whether to knock or retreat. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on him. Mary captured this moment with quiet tension, describing how he finally tapped gently on the door, hoping the sound would be received not as a threat but as a plea. Mary wrote of the scientist awakening with a start, heart pounding as he listened to the faint knock. For a moment he sat frozen, memories flooding back, the creature's face, his voice, their last conversation. He rose slowly, knowing he could no longer avoid the responsibility that had followed him across forests and towns. When he opened the door, Mary described the scene as soft and solemn. The creature stood still, his posture humble, his expression formed not by anger, but by fragile hope. Snow drifted between them, carrying silence like a delicate thread. The scientist did not speak at first, and neither did the creature. Mary allowed the quiet to stretch, heavy but necessary, as both waited for the other to take the first step. Finally, Mary wrote of the scientist gesturing for him to come inside, not with certainty, but with a quiet acceptance that their fates were now bound. And as the creature stepped across the threshold, bringing with him the cold air of the forest, Mary felt the story shifting again, preparing for the next quiet, complex turn in their journey. Inside the small cabin, Mary imagined the air thick with an uneasy quiet as the creature stepped carefully across the wooden floor, the warmth of the fire brushing against his cold skin. The scientist, still shaken from being confronted by the very being he had sought to avoid, kept a cautious distance, though something in his expression had softened. Mary wrote of him setting another log on the fire simply to steady his hands, its crackle filling the silence between them. She described the creature standing near the doorway at first, unsure whether he was welcome, unsure whether to speak. His eyes drifted over the small room, the scattered papers, the dim lantern, the single chair, which felt to him like glimpses into a life he had once wished to share. Mary let the tension ease slowly as the scientist finally invited him to sit, though he did so hesitantly. The creature obeyed with a quiet dignity, folding himself carefully onto the floor rather than taking the only chair. Mary wrote of the scientist feeling a sharp pang at this gesture, recognizing how deeply the creature had learned humility through rejection. They began to speak in soft, halting exchanges. Mary described the creature explaining how he had followed, not out of anger, but because he could no longer bear the weight of solitude. He spoke of long nights in the forest, of learning to read by moonlight, of watching human families with a longing he could not quiet. Mary wrote these confessions with delicate restraint, letting the creature's voice carry both pain and hope. The scientist listened with conflicted emotion. Mary imagined him pressing a hand to his forehead, overwhelmed by the realization that he had created a being capable of such depth. He admitted his fear, his lack of control, his uncertainty, his regret. He didn't excuse himself, and Mary allowed the honesty to build a fragile bridge between them. The conversation turned again to the creature's request. Mary wrote of the scientist explaining the danger of repeating his earlier experiment, the unknown consequences, the possibility of creating another being who might suffer the same fate. She described the creature listening intently, absorbing every word yet remaining firm in his plea. He did not ask for happiness, Mary wrote, only for the chance to no longer be alone in a world that refused him. As the wind rattled softly against the cabin walls, Mary imagined the scientist confronting the moral weight of his choice. She wrote of him staring into the fire, the light flickering across his troubled expression, before quietly promising that he would try. He would create a companion, not immediately and not without caution, but he would honour the creature's plea. Mary described the creature's reaction with quiet subtlety. Not joy, but relief, as though a heavy stone had finally been lifted from his heart. He thanked the scientist in a soft voice, one shaped by months of longing and restraint. As night deepened, Mary ended the scene with the two of them sitting near the fading fire, still strangers in many ways, yet bound by a fragile, necessary understanding. And in that small cabin, surrounded by snow and silence, their new, uncertain agreement settled into place like the first calm after a long storm. In the days that followed their fragile agreement, Mary imagined a quiet routine forming between the scientist and the creature inside the isolated cabin. Though uncertainty lingered, their conversations grew steadier, shaped by the shared understanding that something new, delicate and risky, was beginning. Mary wrote of the scientist gathering his scattered notes, revisiting diagrams he had long avoided, his movements slow and hesitant. Each page he touched reminded him of the night he had first crossed the boundary between life and creation, and the consequences that had followed. She described him sorting through his instruments with careful hands, feeling both obligation and fear settle into his thoughts. The creature watched these preparations with a mix of hope and unease. Mary imagined him helping quietly where he could, bringing water from a nearby stream, gathering wood for the fire, keeping the cabin warm during the long cold evenings. She wrote of how he moved with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his appearance, each gesture shaped by the longing to prove he could live without causing harm. Their interactions remained cautious. Mary described moments when the scientist glanced up from his work to find the creature watching him with searching eyes, and how those moments made him pause, struck by the depth of feeling in a face he once saw only through fear. She wrote of the creature asking careful questions about the plan, how long it would take, whether the companion would understand him, whether she would fear him. The scientist answered honestly, though often with uncertainty. Mary allowed these exchanges to reveal the growing emotional connection between them, a fragile thread formed from shared responsibility and the creature's unwavering hope. As days passed, Mary imagined the scientist outlining the steps of his new experiment, though he admitted he would proceed slowly. He feared rushing. He feared repeating the mistakes of the past. Mary described him walking through the snowy forest in search of materials, using the solitude to gather his thoughts. The creature followed at a distance, protective in a quiet, unobtrusive way. Yet Mary also sensed a growing tension within the scientist. She wrote of him lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if creating another being would truly bring peace, or if it would double the burden he already carried. These doubts pressed heavily on him, and Mary let the uncertainty show in his hesitant movements and distant expression. Meanwhile, she imagined the creature sensing this shift. Though he said nothing, Mary wrote of how he noticed the scientist's long silences, the pauses in his voice, the way he sometimes stared at his hands as if questioning everything they could do. The creature's fear returned. Not fear of rejection, but fear of losing the only hope he had ever known. Mary described him stepping outside into the night one evening. standing beneath a sky filled with pale stars, trying to steady himself against the worry rising inside him. He whispered to the wind, to the quiet trees, hoping the scientist would keep his promise. Back inside, the scientist watched the creature from the window, a heaviness settling in his chest. Mary wrote of how he realised that the creature trusted him entirely now, a trust built slowly, painfully, and that breaking this promise would mean destroying the fragile bond between them. That realisation, Mary described, anchored him. It pushed him toward a decision that felt both daunting and necessary. And as she closed this chapter, Mary left the two of them in the cabin's dim light, one preparing with trembling resolve, the other waiting with fragile hope, both unaware of how profoundly their paths were about to shift once more. As the new year approached, Mary imagined the atmosphere inside the small cabin growing heavier, shaped by the weight of expectation and the slow tension building between the scientist's hesitation and the creature's hope. Snow fell steadily outside, covering the world in soft white, but inside, Mary described a different kind of stillness, one filled with cautious preparation, unspoken fears, and a quiet waiting that stretched through each day. She wrote of the scientist continuing his studies, though his progress remained slow. He examined his notes again and again, revising sketches, adjusting ideas, searching for methods that might allow him to create life without repeating the mistakes of the past. Mary described him pausing frequently, staring at the flickering fire as doubt pressed against his thoughts. He worried that he was stepping once more into unknown territory, worried that his fragile agreement might lead to consequences neither he nor the creature could foresee. Meanwhile, Mary imagined the creature trying to hide his growing unease. He helped wherever he could, collecting materials, keeping the cabin warm, offering quiet conversation. But Mary wrote of how the creature often stepped outside alone, standing among the trees as if trying to steady the mixture of fear and hope inside him. She described him lifting his face toward the cold wind, whispering promises to himself that he must be patient, that the scientist needed time. Yet beneath this practiced calm, Mary let an anxiety take shape, the worry that hesitation might turn into avoidance, that the promise might break under the scientist's growing fear. One evening, Mary wrote of the scientist sitting at the table, shoulders bent as he studied his notes, when the creature approached him gently. Mary described the creature asking if the plan was truly possible, his voice quiet, almost trembling. The scientist looked up, startled by the vulnerability in the creature's expression. He hesitated before answering, explaining that the work was difficult, that he needed more certainty, more preparation, more time. Mary imagined the creature listening in silence, absorbing the uncertainty. He did not accuse, but Mary wrote of a subtle shift in his posture, a quiet fear returning, the kind that grows when hope begins to thin. The next day, Mary described the scientist leaving the cabin to search for rare materials he believed he needed. His steps were slow, his thoughts tangled in doubt. Mary wrote of him wandering farther than planned, using the solitude as space to question whether he could truly create another life responsibly. In his absence, the creature remained at the cabin, pacing restlessly. Mary described him tending the fire, placing logs carefully as though trying to occupy his thoughts. Hours passed, each one adding weight to his worry. She imagined him stepping outside repeatedly, scanning the forest for any sign of the scientist. When the scientist finally returned at dusk, exhausted and empty-handed, Mary wrote of the creature greeting him with visible relief. But the scientist's expression told another story. He admitted he had found nothing useful, perhaps because the materials were scarce, or perhaps because part of him had not truly been searching. Mary allowed the creature to sense this, though neither spoke of it directly. As the chapter closed, Mary described them sitting in the dim cabin, the fire low, the silence deep. The scientist felt the weight of responsibility pressing harder than ever. The creature felt the first tremors of doubt shaking the foundation of his fragile hope. and outside, winter thickened, as if the world itself understood the quiet tension forming between them. As winter grew harsher and the days shortened into brief stretches of pale grey light, Mary imagined the tension inside the cabin tightening into something neither the scientist nor the creature could easily name. Their fragile cooperation, held together by hope, fear, and unspoken expectations, began to strain under the weight of uncertainty. Mary wrote of the scientist waking each morning with a heaviness that settled deep in his chest. The notes scattered across his table seemed more confusing than helpful, their lines and symbols twisting into reminders of the night he had first created life without understanding the responsibility it carried. She described him staring out the frost-covered window, watching the snow fall in soft, relentless waves, wondering whether he truly possessed the strength or conviction to attempt such a creation again. Meanwhile, Mary imagined the creature growing increasingly aware of the scientist's hesitation. She wrote of him observing the man's anxious behaviour, the long silences, the unfinished sentences, the way his hands trembled slightly when he handled his instruments. Each detail made the creature's heart ache in quiet fear. Mary described how he tried to offer reassurance, speaking gently, performing chores with care, hoping that his efforts would restore the scientist's resolve. Yet the unease persisted. One evening, Mary imagined the scientist sitting before the dim fire, the flames offering little warmth. The creature approached cautiously, sensing the man's troubled mood. Mary wrote of the creature asking softly whether the promise still held, whether the plan was moving forward. The scientist hesitated, long enough for the creature to understand. Mary allowed this silence to settle like a slow, cold weight. The scientist admitted he was uncertain, that the work demanded clarity he didn't yet have, that he feared the unknown consequences. Mary described the creature listening in stillness, his expression shifting, first confusion, then sorrow, then something deeper, something shaped by months of fragile hope beginning to crack. She wrote of the creature stepping outside into the freezing night, needing space to breathe as snow drifted around him. He stood beneath the bare branches, gazing at the pale moon, whispering questions into the wind. Was he destined to be alone forever? Had he misunderstood the promise? Did he ask for too much? Inside, Mary imagined the scientist watching from the doorway, regret tightening in his throat. He wanted to call out, but fear held him still. Fear not of the creature, but of breaking his trust completely. The next morning, Mary described an uneasy quiet between them. The creature helped with the fire and fetched water, but he moved with a gentler, more subdued rhythm. The scientist attempted to resume his notes, though his hands moved slowly, every line filled with doubt. Mary wrote of both figures existing side by side in silence, each sensing the other's hesitation yet unable to speak it aloud. As days passed, Mary felt the emotional distance widening. She imagined the creature venturing farther into the forest during the day, not to avoid the scientist, but to calm the storm inside him. He returned each evening, hopeful for progress, yet finding the same scattered notes untouched on the table. Mary wrote of this quiet disappointment settling deep in the creature's heart, shaping the first fragile threads of disillusionment. And as the chapter closed, Mary described a storm gathering outside, a reflection of the growing conflict within the cabin. Snow lashed against the windows, the wind howled through the trees, and inside, two beings who desperately wanted to trust each other sat in separate shadows, waiting for a truth neither knew how to say. The storm that swept across the mountains that night seemed to mirror the growing unrest inside the cabin, and Mary imagined the wind pushing fiercely against the wooden walls as if urging the truth to finally surface. Inside, the scientist sat motionless at the table, staring at the instruments he no longer knew how to use. The flickering fire cast shifting shadows around him, each one reminding him of the responsibility he had tried so hard to reason through. Mary wrote of his thoughts circling endlessly, fear of repeating past mistakes, fear of failing the creature, fear of unleashing more suffering into the world. Meanwhile, she imagined the creature returning after hours spent wandering through the storm, his heavy footsteps dragging snow across the floor as he stepped inside. Mary described how he shook the cold from his shoulders, watching the scientist with careful eyes. There was no anger in his expression, only a sorrow deepened by days of uncertainty. The creature sat near the fire, letting the warmth settle into his frozen hands, and Mary wrote of the quiet between them growing heavier than any words they could offer. Finally, the creature spoke, his voice low, shaped by heartbreak rather than frustration. He asked whether the scientist still intended to keep his promise, whether the work was truly moving forward. Mary described how the question hung in the air like a fragile thread, trembling in the dim light. The scientist looked down. His silence answered before he could shape the words. Mary wrote of the creature's face falling slightly, not with anger, but with a deep, weary resignation. He asked softly if the scientist feared him, or feared what he might create. The scientist finally admitted the truth. He feared both. He feared the unknown, feared consequences he could not control, feared the weight of repeating what had already caused so much pain. Mary described the creature listening in stillness, snow melting slowly from his clothes onto the wooden floor. He nodded, the motion small yet full of sorrow. He understood fear. He had lived inside it since the moment he opened his eyes. But Mary allowed him a moment of quiet strength as he explained that companionship was not a selfish request. It was a plea born from the unbearable loneliness he'd endured. She wrote of the creature rising slowly, stepping toward the window where the storm howled against the glass. He looked out at the swirling snow, his reflection faint beside the darkness. Mary described him saying that if the scientist could not keep his promise, he should at least speak the truth plainly. The scientist, trembling, finally admitted he did not know whether he could complete the work. Mary wrote of the creature turning back, a mix of grief and newfound clarity settling over him. He thanked the scientist, not for the promise, but for the honesty he had withheld for too long. And as the storm raged outside, Mary ended the scene with the creature stepping into the cold once more, leaving behind footprints that disappeared almost immediately beneath the falling snow. Mary imagined the creature moving through the storm with neither direction nor destination, only the heavy ache of realization settling deeper with each step. Snow clung to his shoulders and hair, melting slowly against his skin, but he felt none of the cold, only the quiet collapse of the fragile hope he had carried for so long. Mary wrote of him wandering into the forest, past the pines bent beneath the weight of winter, the wind pushing against him like a force urging him to face his loneliness once and for all. She described how he stopped beneath a towering tree, its branches trembling in the storm, and allowed himself to finally feel the full gravity of the scientist's confession. He had not been abandoned out of hatred, but out of fear. Yet the result was the same. Mary let his thoughts drift through every memory. The cottage family he had watched with longing, the words he had practiced in the dark, the tender hopes he had stitched into his imagined future. All of it, she wrote, now felt impossibly distant. Meanwhile, Mary imagined the scientist pacing inside the cabin, unable to quiet the turmoil inside him. The creature's departure weighed on him with an unsettling finality. She described him standing at the window, watching the storm erase the tracks left behind, feeling guilt gather like a tight knot in his chest. He knew his hesitation had wounded the creature more deeply than any fear he carried. Mary wrote of him stepping outside despite the storm, calling faintly into the wind, though he knew the creature had already moved beyond reach. His voice disappeared into the night, swallowed by the snow. Back in the forest, Mary let the creature find a small clearing, the storm calming just enough to reveal the muted glow of moonlight filtering through the clouds. He sat on a fallen tree, his breath rising in soft clouds, his thoughts moving slowly through sorrow and clarity. Mary described him realizing that he could no longer wait for someone else to provide meaning to his existence. The scientist had given him life, yes, but purpose, belonging, companionship. These were things he would have to seek or shape on his own. She imagined him lifting his gaze toward the faint moon, understanding for the first time that he must choose his path without relying on promises that others were too afraid to keep. Mary wrote of him standing, the snow settling gently around him, now that the storm had quieted. He felt stronger in his sorrow, not hardened but clarified, as though the world had finally shown him the truth he had been unable to face. In the cabin, Mary described the scientist returning inside, drenched with snow, feeling the weight of his regret settle more profoundly than before. He sat near the dying fire, staring into the embers as though searching for a way to undo what had been done. But Mary allowed him no easy answers. She wrote of him realizing that the creature's next steps were beyond his control, that the consequences of fear and hesitation had already taken root. As this chapter closed, Mary left the creature alone in the quiet forest, standing beneath a sky brightening slowly after the storm. He was colder, lonelier, and more burdened than ever before, but he was no longer waiting. He had begun to move forward with a new, solemn resolve, one shaped by heartbreak, but guided by a fragile, enduring will to find meaning on his own. Mary imagined the final steps of the creature's journey beginning in the quiet winter dawn, when the storm had cleared and the world lay softened under a smooth layer of pale snow. He moved through the forest with a steadiness he had never felt before, not from confidence, but from a silent understanding that he could no longer return to what had been. Mary wrote of him pausing at the edge of the trees, looking back toward the faint outline of the cabin hidden in the distance. There was no anger in his expression now, only a wistful ache, a final acknowledgement of what hope had tried and failed to build. She described him whispering a soft farewell, not to the scientist alone, but to the dream of companionship that had shaped so much of his longing. Then he turned away, stepping into the vast, untouched snow. Meanwhile, Mary imagined the scientist waking slowly that morning, exhaustion weighing on his limbs as he realized the creature had not returned. She wrote of him stepping outside, the cold biting into his skin, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Only empty whiteness greeted him. The scientist felt a heaviness settle deeper into his chest, a realization that the creature's departure marked a turning point, not only for the being he had created, but for himself. Mary described him walking a short distance into the forest, calling out softly, though he knew no answer would come. Each unanswered call pressed a sharper truth into his thoughts. His fear had shaped the creature's sorrow. His hesitation had carved a path that now stretched beyond his reach. Mary allowed him a moment of quiet reflection as he returned to the cabin, understanding that the story he had tried to confine to science had become something far larger, an emotional mirror he could no longer look away from. He sat at the table, staring at the empty chair across from him, and Mary wrote of how he finally grasped the depth of what the creature had sought. Not perfection, not power, but connection, companionship, and a small place in a world that had never welcomed him. Back in the wilderness, Mary imagined the creature moving steadily toward the distant mountains. She described how he followed the path lit by the rising sun, feeling the cold air brush gently across his skin. His sorrow remained, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, Mary wrote of him carrying it with a quiet dignity, knowing it was part of the life he'd been given. She imagined him stopping at a high ridge overlooking a frozen lake, the world stretching wide and silent before him. For the first time, he felt the possibility that meaning did not have to come from another, that he could seek his own purpose in the vastness around him. Mary described him watching the sunlight reflect across the icy surface, feeling something close to peace settle over him, fragile but real. He whispered a promise to himself that he would continue forward, not in bitterness, but in the hope that somewhere in the world there might be a place where he could exist without fear. As Mary brought the story to its quiet close, She imagined the creature descending the ridge, his figure growing smaller against the brightening horizon. The snow muffled his footsteps, the wind carried his breath away, and the world opened before him in a silent invitation to begin again. And in that still, gentle ending, Mary allowed both creator and creation to part not as enemies, but as two solitary souls, each seeking a way to live with the weight of what had been, and the faint enduring hope of what might still be found.